Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am really excited to be here today with life coach Robert Pardi. Welcome, Robert.
Tara, thank you so much. I am thrilled to actually be part of this.
I am too. And I know that you've got so much great stuff to share with the listeners. And you are calling me from your home that's now in Italy. You
Yes.
previously from the United States. And Robert, how is it that you have come to work in this space of death and grieving?
That is a great question, and we could spend hours and hours on that. So I will give you the summary. I was married to an amazing woman. I met her when she was 17, I was 19, and the beauty in, I think, meeting someone so young as you grow up together, you don't bring a lot of baggage, you're more, flexible in a lot of things. And we were just, we were that couple, let's say. But at the height of our everything, my wife was just about to turn 31. She was doing an MD PhD at Mount Sinai in New York. I had just been recruited as a senior portfolio manager for the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. It was like everything was happening for us. She was diagnosed with late stage breast cancer. And this was back in 1998. So it's very hard to give fault to anyone because back then, a 30-year-old young woman, it was very rare for them to have breast cancer if they didn't have a family history. Unfortunately, today it is very common, unfortunately. And so that led us on this journey together. What's very interesting is my wife, because she was studying to become a doctor, when she was diagnosed, they told me the information because she happened to be diagnosed in Dubai. And it wasn't because of the Muslim thing they told the man. I think they were just all very uncomfortable. Here was this young, vibrant woman and no one expected it. So the doctor told me, and I asked my wife, I'm like, what do you want to know? And she said, only the next steps. She said, Robert, I never want to know what's happening because I'm dangerous to myself because I know too much about medicine already. I don't want to think about statistics and so forth. I need you to deal with this. And that was the gift, let's say, I could give her, right? I couldn't save her, but I could actually help support her coping system. Over the 11 years that she journeyed with metastatic breast cancer, I became more of her coach than I did actually of her caregiver because she was very independent, self-sufficient, and she became the founding director of palliative care at New York Hospital with metastatic breast cancer. And that whole thing taught me so much about grief and death and everything else that when she did pass away and I reevaluated my life, I couldn't go back to the investment banking world. It just was not where I was at that moment. I learned about purpose and surrender and the present moment and so many different other things that I looked at my life and I said, okay, so this happened. What would be an amazing story to come from this? And for me, it was to move to Italy because I had always wanted to live in Italy. And I showed up one day. Now, this is a lot of people, when they hear my story, they're like, oh, ex-investment banker, of course he moved to Italy. He had all this money. An 11-year journey with breast cancer is not cheap. There was no money left. My wife did not have life insurance because we were so young, we never thought about it. So I showed up in Italy teaching English for $8 an hour as a Columbia MBA. So let's put that on the side because these shifts are mindset shifts before they're anything else. So I showed up here, didn't have a job, didn't speak the language, didn't know anyone, didn't have a place to live, just with two bags of luggage. And sometimes I think in Italian and then I have to translate it because I have become fluent now. And so sometimes I fumble on my words. And when I thought about what I wanted to do, I'm like, what I missed was supporting her. And I became a life coach. And while I was doing that, I started thinking, what is the gift that I can give back? Because my wife and I both believe that all of our experiences have absolutely no value if we don't share them. And the biggest experience that I learned was navigating grief. And it was in navigating grief that I grew. It was in navigating grief that I also was able to liberate myself from a lot of the unnecessary. And so I said, that's the space I want to work in. That's where I can add the most value. I also, of course, work in the transformation space because of the whole life transformation. But that's what brought me into that. And also, while I was with Desiree, because I was at every appointment she had, I got to meet a lot of people that were in the chemotherapy room. And I was amazed at how many people did it on their own.
Yeah.
So I actually wound up volunteering. They wound up calling me a chemo companion because there was really no word for it, right? But I lived a couple of blocks from the hospital, and I was like, you know what? I'll just come and I'll sit with people, talk to people, I'll help them get home. Because I couldn't imagine a woman, let's say, going through 2 hours of chemotherapy and then getting in a taxi or a bus to go back home by herself. It just was shocking to me. So that whole thing exposed us to so much loss because some of those people didn't survive. And that's where I am. That's what I do, stuff like that.
Amazing, really amazing. I love what you shared with me when we spoke before this, when you described how grief is a fertile land for growth.
Yes.
And a lot of people, when they're really in grief, can't see that in the moment. Would you like to talk about your acronym for grief?
Sure. And it is normal not to see it at the beginning because everything is just so shocking. And what you and I were talking about is my acronym for loss, as well as the lack of self and security. So when you're in the lack of self, it's very hard to see anything else because you don't even know who you are. Your perspective is just, it's all static, right? And if you think about fertile soil, manure is the fertilest thing to use to grow things, right? And that's pretty much what happens when, you're suffering grief at the beginning, that it's manure, it's a fertile substance. So what I realized through my journey and then working with people in this space is that, yes, there are the emotions and not the stages of grief, because they were actually even studied for somebody that was actually dying. It wasn't the people that were surviving. But grief in itself, it stimulates this response, and we have to work through certain things to actually become conscious of the response and choose the reaction and choose a response. So G is for guilt, because one of the things we suffer right away, whether it's survivor's guilt or guilt that we could have done something different, or we may have this belief that, it was karma, or it was some sort of, divine intervention because we were bad. We have guilt and shame and everything else. The R is rumination, because we rethink situations and we can sit in that spiral forever because we're trying to solve for something that can't be solved, and we're trying to find safety in the world. That's one of the reasons why we do ruminate, because if you go from, loss, lack of self, it's lack of self and security. So because you feel unsafe. So we'll ruminate a lot. There's impermanence, which is, for me, it's the greatest liberator to living an amazing life, because we all use the term, this too shall pass, when there's a tough thing happening. But this too shall pass is for every single thing in life. The ancient Japanese used a calendar of 72 seasons. And I think it's absolutely such a beautiful thing. I have one. And it's because change happens so rapidly. And we know that with certain things, right? Technology or whatever, but time is really moving so rapidly. And so you have to understand impermanence. Then there's expectations. Anyone that suffers a loss, especially loss of a loved one, your life was built with an expectation of having them in it and what that would look like together for you. I can tell you, I was supposed to be the successful investment banker with a beautiful, successful wife, living in a penthouse somewhere in Manhattan. It was just, this was the thing, right? That's what our life was supposed to be. And then all of a sudden, none of that existed anymore. In fact, because of her position, we were living in hospital housing. And after she passed away, I also had to leave the apartment. I wasn't, it wasn't my apartment, it was through her job. So you just realize how you have to accept impermanence, and you have to let it liberate you to say, okay, if you just think of it this way, if we hold on to life so tightly, how can we ever grab something new? How is there abundance in life? Impermanence teaches us to hold on to things lightly, and then we can actually receive. And then, so we have grief, rumination, impermanence, expectations, and then I joke all the time, the shadow of the valley of death. Nowhere does this psalm say, as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I sit down, light a campfire, and roast marshmallows. No, it says just to walk through. The end of that valley, there's a curve. And you don't know where that curve is going to go. And that's when fear happens. Fear of rebuilding, fear of letting go, so many different other fears. And so you're trapped. And that's why a lot of people make the valley their home, or they stay in grief because they need to work through that fear. So as you are walking through and you're shedding these things, or you're contemplating these things, grief, rumination, impermanence, expectations, you're strong enough to deal with the fear. And that's why it's fertile ground, because that's where all of us need to learn to grow, is to grow in the face of fear and to live the life we've been given. Because if we hide behind fears, we're actually living only a fraction of the life we're meant to live. And then when it is our time and death comes knocking on the door, well, you know what? We'll look back with a lot of regret because we stayed stuck. And that's when I work with people in grief. Everything shatters so much in our life that, as hard as it is to accept it, that's the easiest place to actually rebuild from.
Yeah, so powerful, Robert. I am sure everyone who has been listening has either hopefully written that down, or will rewind and write it down, because it's really extraordinary. And I find the especially the F part, and you say, people, we can get stuck in grief and stay in that place of like, why are these things happening to me? And I always personally think that there's a really, like, being in the wallowing victim place is very important, because I think sometimes people think, oh no, I want to be the evolved person who's grown from this, and you kind of intellectually understand how that can be, but equally it's important to feel everything, right? And not to bypass that.
That's such a great call out, because to a certain extent we do have to feel everything. A lot of us walk through life with armor. And the more armor we put on ourselves, the more we identify with the armor. That's not real strength armor at all. And so, there is no timeline for grief. There is no method for grief. Everyone deals with it as they can deal with it. What you were talking about, which I think is so important, right, is that you do have to feel it to process it. But that stuckness is the identity of the victim, the identity of this happened to me. We were talking, about my mom, and I'm very open about saying it, that life happened to her when my dad passed away, and she's never let it go. And he passed away in 1999. and it is still very prevalent in her life. That's what I mean by being stuck. Being stuck doesn't necessarily mean that you are still grieving, because I still grieve my wife. I miss her every day. I say all the time I have a beautiful scar on my heart for having loved and lost her. I might see a pair of earrings in a store. It's 13 years later, and I have an instinct to go buy them because I know she would like them. And that brings up a grief reaction, of course. That doesn't incapacitate me as is when it was fresh, because I learned how to deal with it. But that being stuck is saying, I'm just going to accept this identity, and I am going to sit here, and life is bad and I am the victim. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the whole journey with grief is the opportunity to start to think about beliefs and how you've been limited in the past, and to shed those as well, because it's another one of those strange things. And I'm a Roman Catholic. I was brought up Roman Catholic, but I'm a spiritual person more than anything else. And I like to study a lot about Buddhism and all of that other stuff. We put the definitions of good and bad. Yes, there are morality issues and things like that. But in general, the dynamics of nature, where unfortunately death is part of nature, it's sort of a neutral event, because it's supposed to happen. There's no timing for that. And that's where a lot of work needs to be done with grief, in terms of saying, getting someone to not sit there and feel like life happened to them, life punished them, they are the victim. It could take, for me, my wife was also a palliative care doctor, right? And we had a lot of conversations about extending life and extending death and a lot of that other stuff. And I can tell you, I don't know why I decided to do this in the hospital when she passed away, before they were going to put her in the bag and take her out of the room. I was like, well, can I bathe her body instead of you bathing her body? Because I had learned everything. Like, I learned how to take blood from her and to flush a port and all that other stuff towards the end of her life. So as I was bathing her body, she was only in the hospital for 2 weeks, and I turned her. The bed sores on her back were incredible. And that for me was an indication. Now, of course, she was sort of a more expected death. That's somebody that just dies, suddenly. So there's definitely a different dynamic there in terms of accepting death. But when I looked at that, I'm like, okay, her body could not contain her anymore. It's just, it had reached its useful point. In that, as you're thinking about, victim, and as you're thinking about, moving forward and how you deal with life, one of the things Des and I, so her name was Desiree, but I called her Des. So one of the things that Des and I really focused on the moment she was diagnosed was that cancer was not going to be the dominant color in the painting of our life. It was going to be an accent color to highlight joy. And so when I think about her life, and people saying, oh, when she had a short life, she wasn't even 41, she was just about to turn 41. She had a joyful, full life. If we measure life by joy instead of just by the number of years, it's a completely different dynamic, because there are people that have lived a very long life and maybe have never really felt joy, have just been depressed and sad and feeling in that situation of life happening to them. And so part of, let's say, working through grief or growing from grief is to sit there and say, okay, how can I focus on the present moment? How can I accept impermanence? How can I realize that I am not a victim or even a survivor to life? I am here to experience it. And like you said, you have to let the bad stuff in as well, because we can't compartmentalize and only deal with, the beauty of life, and then something bad happens and we can't ignore it. We have to feel it. We have to grow from it. That takes time for sure. And for some people, it's a long process. For me, like I said, it was a short process. Desiree was a palliative care doctor. I was like, all right, well, now what am I going to do? And I even said this to her when she passed away, and she was, before they came in and they took her away, I was like, okay, baby, listen, you know who I am? And she was, she passed away, but I'm talking to the body. And I'm like, you know who I am? Tomorrow, I'm donating all your clothes, getting rid of the furniture. It was just my way of having to deal with certain things. That doesn't mean it's right for everybody. But the thing that you need to find is what's right for you, and not to just stay there and look at that curve and the fear and say, I'm good here.
Yeah. And I think that that's the thing when you're in that sort of, very sad place, it's so hard to sort of, find the joy again, which is perhaps when you need, some assistance from a coach like yourself, maybe taking yourself, to a retreat and surrounding yourself with people, like you're saying, like the beliefs about, your life, or, the greater beliefs, spiritual beliefs. And as you're saying, like when you're really at that sort of almost ground zero, then it's a place to build from. And that there could be, this is fertile ground, even though it may not feel that way.
You said something that is so important. And if we think about, that ground zero, and when you can't see joy anymore, and some people just don't have the ability to work with a coach or a therapist or go to a grieving group. And the one thing I will say is that I've run grief workshops and grief groups, and the focus is on not about sympathy. It's more about empathy, and it's more about understanding that, again, impermanence. This is a temporary point that you're going through. But when you are at that ground zero, one of the best things to think about or do is actually to daydream. And as crazy as it sounds, because as an adult, we're not told to daydream, but it gets you out of the spiral you're in. And, the daydreams don't have to come true, but you have to start to see more color than gray. We were talking about the kaleidoscope earlier, right? Like I always have a kaleidoscope with me because I just think it's fantastic. If the kaleidoscope only had gray colors in it, we really wouldn't enjoy it, right? So, it's the daydreaming allows us to start to think about, oh, I always wanted to read that book, or you know what, I really would like to paint this one wall. I always liked this color. You start to think about that. Now, are you going to execute on them? That's a different story. But the first piece is you have to start to see color again. It's like, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, and then you land in Oz and there's all these colors. Slowly but slowly, you have to start to see color again. That's where you start to find moments of joy. If you think about a child, and I've seen this in my own family, but I remember this even as myself. Let's say, unfortunately, grandma passes away and you're 5 or 6 years old, and you go there and you don't really understand it, but you see grandma's not there anymore, and you see everyone sad and you're feeling sad. But if there are a few kids in that funeral home, 5 or 10 minutes, they'll start playing, they'll start hiding behind, I don't know, a plant in the room. They'll get yelled at by their parents because there's still so much connected to the play and everything else that exists in life. As we get older and older, we have a feeling, because of the expectations and fooling ourselves into there's things that we can control, and there's so much. We can only control how we show up. We can control our response to life. It's our thoughts, our efforts, and our actions. I always say it's a cup of tea. So for you Brits, you drink tea all the time. That's easy for you to remember. So there is just a tiny little tool when you're at ground zero. Just throw a little fantasy of maybe, what could be, maybe, oh, I'd love one day to be able to go to, sit on a beach somewhere, and then maybe there's something very small. One of the things that Desiree and I learned towards the end of her life, the idea of hope, is hope can be damaging to a certain extent, because I could have sat there and hoped for a cure. I could have hoped for some divine intervention. I even was bringing her to India. I crawled on my knees in Lourdes in France or wherever it was. I forget where I was. She was here in Italy during the Jubilee. I made her walk through all the doors. I'm like, get absolved of your sins. You hope for anything. But when you surrender to the fact of the long term and you start hoping for the best day today, that's your role at the beginning of grief, is to do a small thing. Maybe it's to get out of bed, brush your teeth. But it's about the day. It's not about your whole life. And that's one of the tools, again, to help someone deal with grief, is just focus on today, right now, daydream a little bit. Des used to love to go to the beach. So much so, by the end of her life, she couldn't. And she had so many, because the cancer had spread to her intestines. There were bowel issues as well, that she was afraid to travel. And so one day I said, you know what? This was an Uber. It was taxis at the time. I said, let's take a taxi to Coney Island. Let's grab a hot dog from Nathan's and go stand and put our feet in the water. And we got the hot dog, we were eating it, and she took off her shoes, and I just watched her walk to the shore. And it was so beautiful. And she put her feet in, she turned around, she had it makes me teary right now, because the smile on her face was incredible. And then she came back and she said, Robert, I need to go home. But all of that moment of her smiling and feeling the water, all the stuff that was in her mind, which I will never know because we didn't talk about her disease. So of course she knew at that point that she was dying because she was so thin. And at that point, she had tumor burden in her lung, her spine, her peritoneum, her liver, and her small intestines. And the joy of the water touching her toes. And it was a small thing. It lasted maybe 10 minutes. We got back in a taxi. We went back home and she went to sleep. That's the same thing if you're going through grief. Can you find that water? Can you find that 10 minutes just for yourself, that one moment? And if the rest of the day is gray and you had that one little piece of color, you know what? Maybe tomorrow you'll have 2 pieces of color. And then before you know it, the more you play with your kaleidoscope and you turn it and you turn it and you turn it, you're going to be like, wow, okay, there's more color than gray. And then you'll see a rainbow again.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
And yeah, it makes me think about how it's these simple things, isn't it? While we're in this human life, like the nature, the beach, the sand, the trees, the mountains, the lakes, the animals. And these are things that are free.
Yes.
And, talking of animals.
that's a little bundle of joy right there.
And yeah, when we are not in our human body, when we're, dead, we don't know necessarily how that is, but these are the things that I imagine that Desiree, my mum, my dad are sitting near us now going, yeah, these are the things we're missing, in human form.
Yes.
Eat that ice cream. I wish I could have that gelato, and to remind ourselves that we are in this human body and we need to embrace that.
Yeah. That I have a quote that is in the memoir that I wrote for Desiree. And it's because we really learn this. So you can only live an extraordinary life when you value the ordinary moments. It's those sprinkles on an ice cream cone. It is all the small little things that we are blessed to experience. And then I've had people say to me, yeah, but there's people that are blind and they can't see nature. But they have senses that we don't understand because they don't have that sense. So maybe they smell nature in a different way for something that we couldn't even express. A friend of mine's daughter, she was born with a disease where she was unable to speak, unable to walk. She was in a wheelchair basically for 27 years until she passed away. But she had the most expressive smile and giggle, and she communicated energetically, like you knew how happy she was or if something was wrong with her without words and with everything else. So, we are so unique and we are so different, but all of these things around us, they are all, like you said, free gifts. If there's, I think it's a Buddhist saying, I'm not really sure, but they say whenever you feel like you have really heavy problems, just look at the sky and just realize how big everything else is. And that can help bring, perspective to what you're dealing with. I find more that if you look up or you look at something that really resonates with you, I live in a national park, the mountains, and if I just look out at the mountains and I experience them, it's not to look out and take a picture real fast and then send it on, Instagram or something like that. It's no picture, just to sit there and really look and absorb it. That does shift your energy. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is also the work that I've done in grief, right? Like if you are feeling a weight, and sometimes you need somebody to help you with this, to say, hey, you know what? Go out and walk in the park. Maybe it's autumn. Go look at the colors of the leaves. Because a lot of people will resist that because you feel like, well, this isn't right, because I was supposed to have X person next to me. But it's inevitable that as you're spending time in that space and you are seeing all these little moments of joy, it's like when we see a rainbow, we talked about this earlier, most people will stop and you're present. You feel that tickle in your chest, that, ooh, that's beautiful, right? You don't have to earn that. You don't have to buy that. You don't have to achieve that. It's there. And that is, for me, one of the greatest powers we have is to lean into joy, learn how to lean into joy, because that's the light that starts to evaporate the darkness. So that's my little.
Yeah. Joy seeking, that's what was coming to me. And actually something else, just a little bit of a different tangent, but what drew Desiree to doing palliative care?
Oh, great question. So I wish the episode happened during like the internet, because she was actually on the Oprah Winfrey show after she graduated medical school. And she wanted to use her experience to be a better doctor and also to change the concept of medicine. So after she finished medical school, she said, you know what, I want to do a fellowship in palliative care, because palliative care is not an end of life. Hospice is the end of life part of palliative care. Palliative care should be something that starts from the diagnosis of a chronic or terminal illness. It's all about quality of life. Palliative care is a great way to live our life, if you really think about it, because it asks the question, what is quality of life to you? So she said, you know what? I live that, because when she was first diagnosed, and she was diagnosed in the Middle East, she had the surgery in Dubai. We came back to New York and she was getting her chemo and everything else. After chemo, we would fly back together to Abu Dhabi. I was in Abu Dhabi at the time, and she'd recover on the beach, and then we'd fly back. So all that money I was supposed to make as a senior portfolio manager went out the window, but that's okay. So, and she would have to wear a mask before masks were popular, but she was living her life around the disease, which is what palliative care helps you do. So she said, you know what, I'm a living example of what the tenets of palliative care are. Plus, palliative care is all about seeing the patient. And she's like, well, look at me. patient choice. I will not do X, Y, and Z because the doctor tells me to if it doesn't align with me. I have to approach this. I can't be a victim to my disease because the system tells me to be. I have to manage this the best way possible, and I have my own coping mechanisms. And for example, she was supposed to take adriamycin. It was Cytoxin, adriamycin, Taxol, or something like that. It was CAT or TAC or whatever. And she asked the doctor, she said, you know what? I would like it to say ACT because I want to act. Will it have any outcome on the efficacy of these drugs? And the doctor said no. And she's like, so could you give it to me in that order? You know, that to her emotionally had a benefit for the way she was dealing with her disease. So because of her life experience, she said, you know what? I need to be in that field. And she spoke all around the country, the United States, about patient choice and quality of life. And that's how I knew the difference between extending life and extending death and all of these other things, and witnessing as well, right? Like a lot of caregivers want to save the person, and none of us can. And if I then, let's say I'm with someone, and Desiree, we could just use Desiree, and I try to fix her, I'm trying to save her, I've just made her an object. That's not my role. I'm there to witness and support. It's hard to get to that point. That is also, to a certain extent, what we need to do with ourselves. When we are grieving, we don't need to be fixed. We need to witness our grief. We need to understand it. We need to accept it. But it's not that we're broken and I need to fix this and get rid of it. It's no, here it is. I have to look at it, all sides of it, turn it upside down and everything else. And then I have to see what to do with it, because that grief is outside of me. I can look at it. It's not my identity. And that's the shift.
Wow, I am so inspiring hearing about Desiree's path.
Oh, she was great.
Yeah, and how you're continuing that work in her honor and her memory. And I always like to ask people, and maybe you've almost summed it up as well, you know, what your interpretation of the term conscious grief would be.
Well, yeah, I think we definitely did touch on it, but honestly, I'd say exactly what I just said, the last thing I just said, in terms of that we can't stuff it down. We can't hide from grief. We can't ignore it. We also can't become it. We have to consciously realize that this is a period in our life that we're going through and address it in that way. It is not, again, it is not something happening to us. And so if we become conscious of the event, then we're able to move forward.
Yeah, so powerful. And I like that when people sort of say, you know, it's not happening to me, it's happening for me. And that's a way that, you know, having that more learning orientation to our lives and our experience. Yeah, so Robert, thank you so much for this. I would also, I know that you have a gift for people with your joy modules. So do you want to explain a little bit more about that?
I certainly would, and I'm so happy to be able to provide them. So basically, I'm a big believer in snackable content for growth. And so my joy modules they're 9 micro videos of 5 minutes each. I'm not in the video, but it's my voice, I'm speaking, and it walks you through understanding joy. And then at the end, I give a little sort of, worksheet of, just imagine if a doctor came to you and said, you're going to die tomorrow unless you find 1 hour a day to sit in joy. Well, you would certainly find 1 hour a day to sit in joy. So the question is, what does that look like? It could be coloring, it could be walking in nature, it could be play. There's a million different things. I have a friend that loves to play the piano. She's so joyful when she plays the piano, but she's not perfect. And so she doesn't like to play the piano until she really learns. And I'm like, just go sit and play with the keys. That's joy. Just touch them, right? So it just walks you through understanding a little bit how joy is not happiness and that joy always exists.
Oh, that's interesting. Like, joy is not happiness. Yeah. Do you want to just share a little bit more about that before?
Not at all. Sure, we could think about the rainbow, right? Happiness is, let's say you buy a new car, right? Happiness is the acquisition of something, or the achievement of something. It's external. But you get that new car, you love that new car. It just becomes a car when the new car smell fades. Like, it doesn't stimulate you every day forever, right? Joy is internal. Joy is looking at everything with curiosity and wonder. Joy is what a child feels. And so that's why I'm such a big believer in joy. My second book is all about sort of understanding joy. It's written as if an 8-year-old wrote the book. So it's really, really simple, but it is for adults because it walks us back into imagination and curiosity.
Oh, so. I love that. So we will have the links below this to getting the joy mindset videos and a link to your website and your books as well. So everybody who's been listening, I'm sure they're going to be fascinated to go and visit your website and hear more about your work. So thank you so much, Robert, for being here and sharing your story with us. It's very powerful.